Here we go again. The Brit Pack is back. It is Monday, September the 19th, 2016. Simon Head and Chael Sandhu back behind the mics once again for your weekly dose of MMA chat with a distinctly British accent. This week it is episode number 9, and on this week's show we take a look back at UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas, where Michael Johnson and Derek Brunson scored quick-fire stoppage wins to push their respective championship ambitions. Then we look at the shock news of Chael Sonnen's return to MMA, but not with the UFC. He signs with Bellator MMA. We will discuss that big move later in the show. And then, as a bit of a change, we'll don our matchmaking trousers for the third part of the show, where we offer our respective takes on who each of the UFC's world champions should be facing next. Some of them should be straightforward. Some of them, I expect we might have a few differences of opinion, but we'll have to see. And as we do each and every week, we'll wrap up the show by answering your questions as tweeted to us at the Brit Pack MMA. Mr. Sandhu, it's been a week since we spoke. I've heard a vicious rumour that you're going to go watch Tottenham Hotspur against my beloved Gillingham this week. Is that true?
The rumours are true, Simon. I ended up, it's been a while since I've been to the lane. I ended up going to the Sunderland game yesterday on Sunday. And it was good to be there. In a previous lifetime, I was actually a steward. I used to work at the lane for about 4 years, and I used to steward in the away section. And I used to be there pretty much for every home game. I was there during the Martin Yole and Harry Redknapp era. So it was good to be back. It was good to see the lads get a performance in, and the main thing, get the result. And like a London bus, you wait for a while, and then all of a sudden two come along at once. So I should be going to the midweek Carling Cup game against your beloved Gillingham. And I think if the rumours are true, Simon, you might be popping along to the game. And if that's the case, we might have to meet up prior to the match and maybe get a few beers in.
Yeah, so it sounds like a plan. I need to see if I can negotiate myself out of some family stuff on Wednesday night. But if I can, I'm reliably informed that there is a ticket waiting for me. So I know you kindly offered me a ticket to come and sit with you, but as a Gillingham fan, I there's no way I would last 90 minutes in the Spurs end sitting on my hands for that long. If we got even remotely near the penalty area, I would give the game away. I'd be out on my ear, no problem. So if I go, I will be firmly ensconced in the away end, making plenty of racket with my fellow Gills fans. But maybe we'll revisit this on next week's show, and you can gloat over how many goals you've beaten us by. But it's not a football podcast; it is an MMA podcast, and
that's right.
We're kind of in the middle of I hesitate to say the word low key, but it's kind of the calm before the storm. We've got a few fight night shows before the next big pay-per-view, which happens on this side of the pond in Manchester at UFC 204. Let's look at what happened last weekend first. Just a matter of days ago, UFC lightweight contenders Dustin Poirier and Michael the Menace Johnson, who come from rival Florida gyms. Michael Johnson is from the Black Zillions. Dustin Poirier from American Top Team. They've got a long and storied rivalry down there in Florida. They went head-to-head in the main event at UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas. And I don't know who you picked to win that main event beforehand, but I'll hold my hands up. I had Dustin Poirier winning that fight by stoppage. And in true Simon Head predicting tradition, it went completely pear-shaped for Dustin. And he got knocked out by Michael Johnson. Really impressive performance from him. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I'm the same, Simon. I had Dustin going in, and it was one of those predictions where how can you pick against Dustin? Since losing to McGregor, a few years back, moving up to lightweight, he just looked like a world beater, and he's just been running through the division, making his way up the ranks. And adversely, Michael Johnson had a pretty poor 2015, back-to-back losses, the most notable being the decision loss to Nate Diaz last December, and we haven't seen him since. So it was kind of hard to kind of gauge what kind of Michael Johnson we'd get. And more often than not, the UFC does apply the 3 strikes and you're out rule. So he had a lot of pressure, and his back was definitely against the wall coming into this fight with Poirier. But my God, did he put on a performance? if that's definitely one way to kind of shut the naysayers up and shut the critics up and re-establish yourself by getting a main event slot win against a fighter of the caliber of Dustin Poirier by finishing him. And I think there was a little bit of chatter online about perhaps could it have been an early stoppage. The co-main event, in my opinion, definitely was, and I'm sure we'll get to the co-main event in a bit. But for me, it was a perfectly good stoppage. A little bit of controversy with his post-fight celebration, kind of taunting Poirier as he was kind of getting his wits about him after being knocked out. But he did apologize about that, and I think it was just the heat of the moment getting to him, and I think just the release of getting back in the win column. But look, when Michael Johnson performs, when he's at his best, he can really compete with the best of them in the top 10 of that division. I think the key for him now moving forward is consistency, is putting on performances like that, 2 or 3 times a year. Hopefully, if he can get a streak put together, he's got all the attributes definitely to be a title contender in the near future.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think his hands are among the best in the division. He's got very, very slick hands, and I thought that was his best way to gain a victory. But I thought it would be via sort of sticking and moving his way to a decision. I didn't see him blasting Poirier out there inside a round, but that's what he did. He hit him with an absolutely perfect 1-2 combination. Poirier went down. And, no arguments with the stoppage at all. I thought the stoppage was spot on. I think it was Dan Mugliotta, the referee. I thought he got it spot on. And, the celebration we saw afterwards, probably not what we needed to see. But, this is an emotional sport, and sometimes things happen. The best thing to come out of that was the fact that he apologised straight afterwards. So... Michael the Menace Johnson, showing that he's still definitely a factor in that 155-pound division. And there's so many good fights in that division, I wouldn't mind seeing him in there against someone like Nate Diaz again. I know Nate Diaz is probably going to hold on for Conor McGregor, but stylistically that would be a great rematch. It'd be a bit of a come down money-wise for Diaz, so I doubt we'll ever see it. But against any other striker in that division, Edson Barboza would be an interesting fight for him as well. I'd like to see that. There's definitely options out there for him. As you say, consistency is key. If he can rack up 2 or 3 wins against top 10 opposition, then he'll be knocking on the door of a title shot in what is probably the most crowded division in the UFC. So interesting to see where he goes, and also interesting to see what happens with Dustin Poirier next. He's looked fantastic at 155, having moved up from 145. I certainly don't think he should move back down again. I think this is just a bump in the road for him. He just needs to get back to the drawing board and come again. So looking forward to seeing how he fares on his comeback. The co-main event, Derek Brunson versus Uriah Hall. It would appear these two don't get on too well. But when it came to fight night, there was only one winner. It was decisive. But there were calls that it was an early stoppage. You gave us a bit of a hint that you thought it might have been. Talk us through it and tell us why you think that stoppage was early.
Yeah, sure. So Brunson clipped him with a left hook as Uriah Hall was circling to his right. And this has happened before to Uriah Hall. He's been caught in a similar position in previous fights, so it's not the first time that we've seen this happen to him. He goes down, and Brunson jumps on top of him, swarms him, and attempts to give him some ground and pound. So he's trying to land some shots from the mount position. But every single shot just missed. You had a few that hit air, you had a few that hit the mat. But I think that action and maybe perhaps the initial shot, which kind of rocked Uriah Hall and kind of rocked his head back, I suppose persuaded referee Herb Dean to call it in that moment. But and look, I'm sure a referee's job, just like a judge's job, being octagon side and cage side, it's a very tough job to do, especially sometimes with the angle you've got. But at the end of the day, the best person with the best seat in the house and whose job it is to try and call it at the best of their ability as a referee. And I think perhaps, with Herb being widely regarded as one of the best, if not, up there in the top 2 or 3 best referees in MMA, this is just my opinion. I expected a little more. I thought he stopped it too early. And I know that this has pretty much divided the MMA community. You've got a certain faction of the community that thinks it was a good stoppage, and a certain group that don't. I'm always going to, veer towards the side of I'd rather it be an early stoppage rather than a late stoppage. But at the same time, it is combat sport. This is a fight game. And just because somebody gets punched once doesn't mean the fight should end, straight away, especially when literally the minute the referee stopped the fight, Uriah Hall was standing up on his feet, not wobbling, looking the referee Herb being dead in his eyes, just wondering what the hell he had just done. But again, that's just my opinion. I think it was an early stoppage, but in regards to how you saw it, Simon, what did you think? Did you think it was an early stoppage, or were you happy with that stoppage?
I think it was a gnats early. I think I'd have given Hall another second or two to see if he could improve the position he was in, because I don't think Hall was finished. I certainly don't think. I think he was in a position where he wasn't at the stage where he wasn't intelligently defending himself. He'd been dazed, he'd been knocked down, and then he was in the process of reacting, and it was when he was reacting that the ref stopped it. I'd have given him another second or so just to see how his reaction was. I mean, it was a little early. I don't think it was horrendously early. He'd been decked quite emphatically by that left hand, and it wasn't it wasn't a case of him being caught off balance. He was legitimately. It was a legitimate concussive knockdown, if that makes sense. So I think I'd rather, as you said, I'd rather see an early stoppage than a late one. And I think that one was just a touch early. I wouldn't be hauling Herb Dean over the coals for it, though. It wasn't horrendous. And obviously Uriah is going to be disappointed. But it is what it is. I think you have to understand when you're stepping in there. The referees are looking out for your safety first and foremost. And if sometimes they're a little too careful, you'd rather it was that way round. So I think you just chalk it up to experience and come again. It's a tough break for Uriah Hall because he didn't really get going in the fight at all. But for Derek Brunson, obviously, it's great for him, and he's looking to move up. And looking above him in that weight division, maybe a fight with someone like Rob Whittaker might be a good idea for him. I know Rob Whittaker. I assume they're going to try and put him on that Melbourne card, and I think most people would love to see him in there with someone like Anderson Silva. But if they can't make that fight, and if Brunson is 100% healthy after this weekend, maybe they'll do a quick turnaround and they'll stick him in there with Rob Whittaker. So that's a fight I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit further down the line. But Brunson, very quietly, is making a name for himself in this middleweight division. He's stopping people, and all the while you're stopping people, your stock's rising. And the time has come now. If they don't give him Whittaker, they've got to stick him in with a name, and then we'll see just how good he can be. But finish maybe just a little bit early. So that was UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas. Obviously, not the biggest and most star-studded UFC show we've had in recent weeks, but there has still been some big news coming from one of the sport's big names this week, Mr. Chael Sonnen, who was suspended by the Nevada State Athletic Commission about 2 years ago now for what can best be described as a cocktail of performance-enhancing substances. HGH, I think EPO was in there. I think there were one or two other substances chucked in there for good measure as well. His anti-doping suspension is coming to an end now, and common wisdom was he was going to rejoin the UFC. And then we found out this week, Sandhu, he's joined Bellator, which completely blindsided me. I did not think that was going to happen. In many ways, it's a perfect fit. I mean, what do you make of it? It's their biggest signing, you could argue.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely floored by the news. I did not see that coming whatsoever. I thought the Rory McDonald signing a month ago, I thought that was a game changer for the promotion. I just couldn't see for at least under 6 months where the next big signing would come from. I'm sure they're still, looking for as many free agents as possible. But if you're giving me a list of potential fighters that Bellator could have signed from the UFC, Chael Sonnen would not have been on that list. I've always just regarded him as being a UFC guy through and through. He's, quite openly had a pretty good relationship with Dana White. He's kind of been a company man in regards to kind of putting the organization over. Obviously, he does a lot of good work for ESPN, which tend to cover the UFC predominantly when they do cover MMA. But the news broke late on Thursday night that Bellator had signed into a multi-year, multi-fight contract. And absolutely, Simon, this is huge. This is massive. We're talking about one of the biggest draws in the history of the sport. I mean, if you want to put maybe a top 5, top 6 of draws in the sport, you've got your GSPs there, your Anderson Silvas, your Ronda Rouseys, your Conor McGregors, Nick and Nate Diaz. You've got to put Chael Sonnen right up there. If it wasn't for Chael Sonnen, I don't think Anderson Silva would have been making the money that he made during their rivalry in that patch. He really helped elevate Anderson Silva to a much higher level in regards to getting wide mainstream appeal and getting more eyeballs on their particular rivalry, and hence thereafter getting more eyeballs on Anderson Silva. But as you said, Simon, he's come off this 2-year suspension. They held a media-only press conference on Friday, which I was a part of. There was some, Chael was being Chael, Simon. He was, I think he had some good material planned. He said he's going to Bellator because he wanted to go on a Legends ass-kicking tour. And on his list were the likes of Tito Ortiz, Fedor Emelianenko, Vanderlei Silva. And to be honest with you, I don't mind it. I really don't. I think it's a good fit. I think it's good for Chael. It's definitely good for Bellator. I think they've got some fights there that they could make for him that he could win. And again, if they can use somebody like Chael Sonnen, who can obviously main event a card, and then just stack that main card with the likes of an MVP and AJ McKee and some of the homegrown talent that they're trying to kind of nurture and bring up the ranks, then this could be a home run. And I think this, again, coinciding with the Rory McDonald signing just a few weeks ago, is going to make a lot of fighters think about their contract situation and kind of, really pay more attention to what Bellator is doing. Because if they're able to sign a Chael Sonnen, then I think all bets are off on who they are capable of signing.
Yeah, it's arguable that there are actually more good fights for Chael Sonnen in Bellator than there are in the UFC, because Chael's kind of been passed by now. The division is much younger in the UFC. They've got this new breed of fighter coming through, and while he can draw, he's basically going to be the sort of the older statesman, the gatekeeper. Whereas here in Bellator, he can really go after some of these character-led fights, and he's created his own weight division already. He's going to fight at gangster weight, is what he said. So, it basically means he's going to fight anybody from middleweight to heavyweight by the sound of it. He doesn't mind having a tear-up with Rory McDonald. Obviously wants Vanderlei. He's always wanted to fight Vanderlei. Tito is the one who he seems to be waxing lyrical about at the moment, which makes me think that that's the most likely first one for him.
Yeah, that would be the bad boy versus the bad guy. That's how they pitched it so far.
There you go. And the thought of Chael Sonnen versus Fedor Emelianenko just boggles the mind. I can't even begin to comprehend what that might look like. But there are, these are fights that people will tune into. And if you're a hardcore MMA fan who's been following the sport for any length of time, when Chael Sonnen is involved in any kind of fight promotion, he's must-see TV. He's great to watch. You say about him being one of the top draws in the sport. The way I would describe him, he's probably the best antagonist or the best opponent in the UFC, or as was in the UFC, because he was never the main guy. He was always the second guy in the equation. So you had Anderson Silva, but then you had Chael Sonnen, and Sonnen was the guy who elevated him. That always seemed to be the case. You know, he was obviously his own character, and like to be the bad guy, you know, and be chief antagonist, if you like. And that seemed to be how his role worked. He was never really the number one guy. He was always the number two guy. But by being such a strong number two guy, it lifted the fight each time. And I think that's what we'll see in Bellator. I think he will do a fantastic job of promoting the fights. And the other thing that hasn't really been discussed is whether he might also be brought in on the broadcast side when he isn't competing. That would seem to me to make complete sense as well. You mentioned about his relationship with the UFC. The UFC, of course, binned him off. He was part of the Fox team, and the UFC and Fox dropped him like a bad habit after the failed drug test. So he was then basically chucked off of Fox and ended up joining ESPN, where I believe he still works as an analyst. So maybe he might even step across and do a bit of TV work for Bellator.
I think he will, Simon. I think I remember on the conference call he mentioned that he was essentially all in on Bellator and on Spike. So he's going to jump on as many opportunities as they're prepared to give him, and I'm sure they're going to roll out the red carpet and try and get him on as many broadcasts as possible, on as many social media, pieces of video content as possible. So he's definitely going to be utilized as to the maximum potential that they can. And a point about the drug testing, there was one quote that he provided with regards, or I suppose one tidbit in regards to a stipulation in his contract. He said that if he tests positive for any drug test under Bellator, not only will he be fined not only will 100% of his purse be withdrawn, but he'll be fined $500,000. And for those that perhaps say Bellator don't do independent drug testing, or the program isn't as good as USADA, I think Scott Coker's message is, look, basically what Dana White's message used to be back in the day is that, hey, we're regulated by the government. We're regulated by the state athletic commissions. Now, obviously, the times have changed with what the UFC have done with USADA. So the benchmark and the industry standard of drug testing in MMA is a lot higher than what it used to be. But Chael Sonnen did say that he's pushing to fight in California, which up there with perhaps Nevada is probably the best regulated state in MMA or in combat sports altogether. With their kind of head, Andy Foster, being notoriously ruthless, and actually in the past has brought in USADA and WADA to do the testing on behalf of the commission at fights. But he was willing to share that information to the media, as I suppose in a way to say, hey, look, perhaps I might not be tested, by USADA, and I'm not going to be in the USADA testing pool, but I suppose this is as good as me getting a massive fine if I do anything wrong in my tenure under Bellator.
Yeah, I think they're basically operating under the old UFC drug testing rules, if that makes any kind of sense. They're going by the athletic commissions, aren't they? So, but I think putting that in place, that's kind of a statement, really, just to say, we're aware of this. We're drawing a line in the sand here, and we aren't just turning a blind eye to this stuff. So, but it'd be really interesting to see just how successful this is, and whether Chael can really elevate the sort of pay-per-view level of these Bellator shows. Because obviously Bellator is still relatively young in terms of the Scott Coker era, and they're building, they're growing, they're adding to their roster. And they're beginning to add some names. We've got Benson Henderson, Matt Mitrione, and now we've got Rory MacDonald, and now we've got Chael Sonnen. And all in their own individual way, they just help raise the bar, both in terms of awareness and in terms of legitimacy as well. So And I think no one will do a better sales job for Bellator than Chael Sonnen. So really looking forward to seeing how big his involvement is within the promotion side of things, and also how he's going to fare when he actually steps into the Bellator Cajun fights. It's been 2 years, and to be away from the sport for that long, we just don't know. I think he's 41 years of age. So,
isn't it interesting, Simon, how many fighters we're either going to or have analysed with regards to coming off long layoffs? I mean, in the last couple of years, we've had to analyse Anderson Silva coming off that horrendous injury. Ronda Rousey's coming up to a year and change. GSP, if he's going to come back, we're looking at a good few years, up to 3 years away. And now Chael Sonnen, like you mentioned, has already been out of the game for 2 years. He had a grappling contest with Michael Bisping for your fight earlier on in the year, and I'm sure he's been trying to keep as best in shape as he possibly can. But nothing can obviously replace full-on MMA training in a camp, and nothing can replicate an actual fight. So you're right, Simon. It'll be interesting to see how a 39-year-old Chael Sonnen looks in 2016, or if he fights next year, 2017. Yeah,
really interesting to see. He's 39, is he?
Yeah.
Ah, right. I've aged him by 2 years. I apologise, Chael. So we'll move on to the next section, and this is kind of a bit different because we've got slightly less topical stuff to really talk about this week. We thought we'd chuck in a little bit of fantasy matchmaking, which everyone loves to play matchmaker, and what we thought we'd do is we'll take a look at the World Championship picture across every weight class of the UFC. This week we had it announced the Welterweight Championship will be defended at UFC 205 in New York City at Madison Square Garden. Tyron Woodley will defend against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, which personally I'm absolutely delighted about. That's the fight that I thought should have been made, and I was a bit disappointed when Tyron started throwing around names like Nick Diaz and GSP, but it's going to be Wonderboy versus Woodley, which is going to be great. So we now know who's going to be battling for that 170-pound title, but there's a couple of title fights that we know are going to happen. Obviously, we know Michael Bisping is set to face Dan Henderson, but let's run through the divisions and offer up who we want to see who we want to see challenging for the title next in each weight division.
Before we begin, Si,
yeah,
question, because we haven't discussed this off air, so this is the first opportunity I'm getting to speak to you about this. Are we going to do this based on meritocracy, or are we doing this based on the fact that if we're the UFC, what would be the biggest money fight we could put on in that division for the champion?
You're the matchmaker, mate. Make whatever one you want to see. Make whatever one you want to see, and that's where we might differ, because we may have slightly different approaches to specific championships. So if we'll start from the lowest weight class and work our way all the way up to the biggest. So we'll start with the women's strawweight division. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Who would you put her in with next?
I actually like the fight with Karolina Kowalkiewicz. I think it's got everything, both meritocracy and I think it's the money fight. I think with regards to meritocracy, she's obviously worked her way up, got the right victories under her belt, and in regards to the kind of the storyline, the angle, both of them being Polish. I know that our media colleagues in the US have mentioned the fact that perhaps you could put this on the day before UFC 205 on a fight night card, perhaps in one of the smaller New York arenas, where that day would actually be Polish Day in New York. And I know that me in the past have said, well, look, you could put that fight on, anywhere in Europe, maybe in Poland, maybe anywhere else in Europe that that has a large Polish contingent, and it'll be easy for Polish fans to get to. So I think put your meritocracy and you put everything in regards to a really good storyline in the bag, and you'll be hard pressed to kind of move me away from the idea of having Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz. And who doesn't want to hear Mike Goldberg pronounce and announce that fight?
Oh, that's cruel. If it was a fight night show, it'd probably be John Anik, wouldn't it?
That's true.
If it's in the States.
And he's actually really good at announcing and pronouncing. I think, doesn't he have some sort of like audio link for all of the UFC staff, where he's essentially recorded the enunciation and the pronunciation of every UFC fighter, so everybody has it on file.
I believe so. I think if you go on the UFC website, I don't know if they still have it. They certainly used to have it. They used to have the fighter saying their own name in audio. Each fighter had their own profile page. And on some of them at least, there used to be a button you could click and the fighter would actually say their name so that you knew how to pronounce them properly. So I don't know, I assume John has either taken that and expanded on it or has gone and compiled his own. But yeah, he's the king of pronunciation for sure. When it comes to that stuff, he makes sure he gets his prep done. I totally agree with you when it comes to the women's strawweight division. I think obviously Claudia Gadelha is still the number one contender, based on the rankings at least. But you know, Joanna has fought her twice and beaten her twice now. Carolina's next in line in terms of rankings. In terms of recent performances, I think she's probably top of the pile. I'm interested to see how Jessica Andrade does, because she seems to be the next rising star of the division. I would put her in with Claudia Gadelha just to see how she gets on. I think that would be an absolute belter of a matchup. But in terms of the title fight, Poland versus Poland, Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz, definitely that would be my fight. We move up to the women's bantamweight division, and Amanda Nunes, she took Miesha Tate to the cleaners at UFC 200. In the main event, that'll be a quiz question for a few years down the line. Who was the main event at UFC 200? It was Amanda Nunes versus Miesha Tate. She won that fight decisively by submission, but it was her strikes that really got the job done and helped get the fight to the mat, where she was able to lock up that fight-winning choke. Who does she fight next? I know who I've got down on my list, but who have you got?
Well, seeing as you let me pick the women's strawweight matchup first, I'll let you have the bantamweight fight first. So I go for it.
All right, let's alternate then. So I'm going for Ronda Rousey. I'm going for Ronda Rousey.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, I'm nothing if not predictable. But the reason why I'm going for Ronda Rousey is because if she's coming back, then this has to be the fight. There's no point bringing her back for a non-title fight. If you bring her back, you put her in a title fight, and if she gets the title back, all hell breaks loose, and you've got Rousey Mania hits again, and then you've got all sorts of options. Miesha Tate could fight her again. Holly Holm could fight her again. Juliana Pena hasn't got much love for Ronda Rousey. That fight could happen. So that would be my fight. I know if you're taking her out of the equation, then maybe Juliana Pena has got a very strong shout. But I just think that right now, if Ronda's coming back, you've got to put her back in there, in a world title fight. And it's a coin flip whether you back her or not to beat Amanda Nunes. I think Amanda Nunes looked like an absolute star against Miesha Tate. But she's very aggressive, and that is exactly what Ronda Rousey wants. She wants you to be aggressive. She wants you to come ploughing forward so that she can use your momentum against you. So that would be a really interesting fight to watch from a stylistic point of view as well. And you know, we talked about Chael Sonnen. How does he come back after 2 years away? Ronda Rousey's been out for a year, you know, it isn't just the physical issue of being out of action for a year when it comes to Ronda. It's the mental side of it as well, because her last outing was an absolute crushing defeat for her. So how will she come back? There's so many unanswered questions when it comes to Ronda. She's kept herself well out of the public eye. All hell will break loose when that fight, if that fight gets announced. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was either the main event or the co-main event of UFC 207 on December 30th in Las Vegas. And if it is, it's going to be absolutely incredible. And then we'll see who the biggest star in the UFC is. Is Ronda Rousey not only returning to get her title back, is she also going to reclaim her spot as the UFC's number one superstar, knocking off Conor McGregor in the process? That'll be an interesting side note when the pay-per-view numbers come back. But that's the fight I'd make anyway. Amanda Nunes, Ronda Rousey. What about you?
Yeah, mate, bang on. It could be anyone in the women's bantamweight division that's the champion. It could be Holly Holm, Miesha Tate, Amanda Nunes. It could be anyone. The biggest fight you could put on, the money fight, but also meritocracy as well. Again, we're talking about who deserves a title shot. Ronda Rousey was undefeated before she got beat for the title. You know, she's been off for about a year now, but she's still got one of the best, if not the best, record in the women's bantamweight division in the UFC. And, you know, we talked about, you know, draws earlier on. She's probably, arguably, in the top 2 of the biggest draws the UFC have ever had, or certainly have in their current roster. She's right up there with the notorious Conor McGregor. So 100%, you know, Ronda Rousey's return is going to be big, blockbuster business. So, you know, with the UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship essentially being, you know, one of the hot potatoes of the UFC Championship belts in the overall company, you know, the heavyweight division being the other, since its inception, really, you'd be hard pressed to not grant Ronda Rousey a rematch, or well, not really a rematch, but a title shot upon her return. It'll be big business. She earns it. She deserves it, and that'll be a hell of a fight. I mean, it'll be good to obviously gauge exactly where she is now, having spent a year out of the game. Has she improved her boxing? Has she improved her overall strategy? What does she look like? These are all unknowns at the moment, but a Ronda Rousey return will definitely not only get the interest of the hardcore MMA community, but 100%, like every Ronda Rousey fight, get the mainstream attracted as well.
Definitely. And will Edmund Tarverdian scream in her face like he did with Travis Brown a couple of weekends ago? That was just nuts. The whole thing was just ridiculous. Let's move up to the flyweight division, 125 pounds. The single most dominant champion in the UFC today, the pound for pound number one, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, is in serious danger of basically fighting himself out of a job as a flyweight champion, because there's barely anybody left. Who does he fight next? Obviously, well, I say who does he fight next? We know he's going to fight the winner of the Ultimate Fighter. Let's assume that he gets through that unscathed. Who does he fight next, Sandhu?
Well, this is interesting because TJ Dillashaw, who currently isn't a flyweight, he's a bantamweight fighter. He came out in an interview, and I can't remember for the life of me which outlet it was. I think it was yesterday, and said that he'd be willing to drop down to flyweight to fight Demetrius Johnson for the championship. And I think looking at the top 15, I'm looking at names that DJ has either already beaten once or beaten twice. I think TJ Dillashaw and Demetrius Johnson, that would be an amazing stylistic fight. And that's my pick. I think that's a sellable fight, or as sellable as a fight as you're going to get for Demetrius Johnson at 125 pounds.
That is one hell of a pick, because I hadn't seen that story. So that one came completely out of left field. That's way better than anything I could have come up with. So I'm happy to go along with that. Just for sort of formality's sake, I was going to say, and it would be a rematch. It would have to be a rematch because he's beaten everyone in that division. Given the winner of Cejudo versus Benavidez, I will put those two against each other. And obviously, I think we're going to see those two against each other. And if he fights Cejudo again, he gets the double. If he fights Benavidez again, he wins him. He beats him 3 times, and I assume he gets to keep him at that point. So, it's going to be. It's really he needs new challenges, and he either needs to move up a weight class, or someone needs to come into the weight class and challenge him. And if TJ Dillashaw can make 125 pounds, then make that fight tomorrow. I think that is absolutely the best possible fight that they could do for him. Now, one of the divisions, the next division up is bantamweight, which is a division that, ironically, I think Demetrius may need to move to eventually to seek further fortune and fame, if you like. The current champion is Mr. Dominic Cruz, who reclaimed his title after a horrendous run of injuries, beating TJ Dillashaw by a very, very close split decision. The big question now is, who does he fight next? And I'm torn on this. I've kind of got an either or, and I'm going to have to come to some sort of decision on this, because I've got TJ Dillashaw down as one of my answers, and the other one is Cody Garbrandt. And
interesting.
The question is, which fight is going to be is going to make the most sense for right now? And I think the one that makes most sense for right now is probably Cody Garbrandt, because he's the guy with the buzz. He's the hot hand right now. He's following in Cruz's footsteps. They both basically got their shot at the title by destroying Takeya Mizugaki. Cruz did it on his comeback fight when he came back from injury, blew Mizugaki away, and then obviously booked himself in that title fight with Dillashaw. Garbrandt, I don't know whether it was Garbrandt who asked for that fight or whether it was just the UFC matchmakers doing a bit of clever positioning. He then basically followed in Cruz's footsteps, took on Takeya Mizugaki, and did an even better job of putting him away. That now tees that fight up perfectly. The pair of them are already jawing at each other over social media, during interviews, backstage at UFC events. You know, the buzz is already there. The rivalry's already brewing. I think you strike while the iron's hot. Make that fight. There is a suggestion that maybe Cody could do with another 1 or 2 fights, just to give him a little bit more seasoning before you sling him in there with such a decorated, experienced guy like Dominic Cruz. But to be honest with you, he's on such a red hot streak of form. I just put him straight in there and see how he goes. If he does lose to Dominic Cruz, I don't think it'll be that damaging for his career. So I think he could certainly rebound from a defeat and come back and become a champion further down the line. But I'd put him in there and give him a go. Give Cody Garbrandt a shot.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Simon. I mean, I suppose there's a few options you got there. If you went Dominic Cruz, TJ Dillashaw 2, then I suppose as a solid co-main event, or at least a fight on the main card, you'd have maybe Cody Garbrandt versus Brian Caraway. Caraway's been streaking. He's ranked number 3 at the moment. Well, he's actually ranked ahead of Cody Garbrandt, according to the official rankings. And in terms of a matchmaker, if you want to try and put some steam behind Cody Garbrandt, the Brian Caraway fight is a fight he could win, and is a fight that he could probably win with style points too. But having said that, I want to just throw an alternative in there, because I think this is going to be a fight that we're going to see somewhere down the road eventually anyway. Frankie Edgar, former UFC lightweight champion, used to compete at 155 pounds at essentially his walk-around weight. He then dropped to 145 pounds, but it's not the most strenuous cut. He believes he could make bantamweight quite comfortably. So just to be different, why not put in Frankie Edgar versus Dominic Cruz? You've got 2 very well-established names that have been around the UFC for a long time. You've got a current champion and a former champion. It's a fresh matchup. Frankie Edgar, one of the best lightweights we've ever had. He's essentially the best featherweight not named Jose Aldo and Conor McGregor. So just to be different, I'll throw Frankie Edgar in the mix versus Dominic Cruz.
In this age of weight cutting, you're making all these guys cut extra weight. You should be ashamed of yourself. but having said that, I think Frankie Edgar, when he does finally hang his gloves up, he's for me going to go down as a absolute A-grade Hall of Famer. I think he epitomises everything that's great about the sport of mixed martial arts, and I think he deserves to become a 2-weight world champion one day. I honestly thought he would do that by winning the featherweight title. It just didn't quite go his way. But at bantamweight, who knows? I think stylistically, Frankie Edgar versus TJ Dillashaw would be an outstanding fight. I would love to see that one day. But Frankie Edgar versus Dominic Cruz for the gold, absolutely, sign me up. I'd love that. I think the only thing that might maybe put that idea on hold a little bit is that you do have 2 or 3 guys who are either in championship contention or just below. So if Frankie jumps in, given that he's not jumping in as a world champion, he might have to earn his keep at 135, win at least one fight before they stick him in for a world championship fight. But yeah, Frankie at 135, I like the sound of that, provided he can make the weight healthily and he feels good walking around at 135 on weighing day, then by all means, let's do it. Let's drop TJ Dillashaw down to flyweight, and we'll drop Frankie Edgar down to bantamweight, and we've got some exciting new matchups coming. So I've gone for Garbrandt, you've gone for Frankie Edgar at bantamweight. So let's move up to featherweight. Personally, I think this is pretty cut and dried. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Conor McGregor has got the undisputed title right now. It's looking incredibly unlikely that we're ever going to see him defend that belt. So we'll work on the basis that he isn't. And we'll work on the basis that Jose Aldo is the interim champion who may eventually be upgraded to the full championship. But we'll work on the basis of it being Jose. His next fight, who should it be? Again, the featherweight division has got a few very strong contenders in there. For me, there is only one person they can put in there. He's earned his keep. He's done the job. He's becoming a real star in that 145 pound division. And I still don't think he gets the credit he deserves. I'd give Max Holloway the shot. And if he can beat Jose Aldo, then people really need to start making some noise about this guy. I think he's a star. I think he deserves his shot. What about you?
100% Simon. I mean, the guy's, he's put in his shift. He's got this amazing win streak put together. Ever since he lost that decision to Conor McGregor, he just looked better and better. He's essentially got Hawaii on his back ever since, BJ Penn kind of went off the radar, but he's coming back as well, which is just another crazy story in itself. But essentially, in terms of the next generation of Hawaiian fighters coming through, Max Holloway is leading that pack and leading it by example. I mean, if he doesn't get the next crack at Jose Aldo, if Conor McGregor drops the championship in favour of moving to lightweight permanently, that will be an absolute travesty. And to be honest with you, looking at the rankings, I don't think you've got too many other options. I mean, underneath Jose Aldo, you've got Frankie Edgar, who they just fought at UFC 200, so that fight's out of the way. And then you've got Ricardo Lamas, Cub Swanson. Nope, not for me. You've got Anthony Pettis now. He just moved to featherweight, got a really good win over Charles Oliveira. But that's just one win. I think, given the fact that he was coming off a few losses himself, he needs a good couple of wins and get used to his weight class before he can start to kind of really put his name forward as a true title challenger. But in terms of, again, like we talked about before, Simon, in terms of true meritocracy, it's got to be Max Holloway.
Yeah, totally agree. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Depending on the weight class, we're sort of leaning towards money fight, and then in other weight classes, we're leaning towards meritocracy. It's all very hypocritical, but but we're trying to offer up what we think might be the best title fight in each weight class.
Simon, also, some weight classes don't give you the option of both.
Correct.
Some only give you the option of meritocracy, or give you the option of quote unquote money weight fights. So and it's all Simon, like anybody else does. This is a star driven sport, and when certain weight classes have 3 or 4 solid stars that you can put as a headline to bring in the pay-per-view numbers, then you've got some real options. And in some weight classes, like for example flyweight, then you might need to get a little bit creative and see if you can move a few fighters around weight classes just to give a fighter like Demetrius Johnson some fresh matchups, because he's just been an absolutely outstanding champion, and he's probably gonna in my opinion he's gonna go on to kind of beat Anderson Silva's record as the fighter in UFC history that had the most title defenses. That's certainly what he's on his way to doing at the moment. But yeah, it is funny. It is funny how we're changing our tune depending on the weight class.
Yeah, as I say, we're complete hypocrites, but at least we're honest about it. So,
yeah.
But yeah, you mentioned DJ. I think the only barrier to him breaking Anderson Silva's record is whether he runs out of opponents. I think that literally, I think that is the only barrier to him doing that. For me, he's the best fighter on the planet right now. But someone else who likes to lay claim to being the best fighter on the planet features in my next match, the Eddie Alvarez championship fight. You can probably guess who I'm going to put him in with. I think it's the fight everyone's going to try and put him in with. Who would you pick to take on Eddie Alvarez out of that talent-stacked lightweight division, Sandhu. All those contenders lining up to face Eddie Alvarez. Who fights him next?
Well, it's got to be, number 14 ranked Rashid Magomedov, surely, Simon. No, I mean, let's be honest. It's the fight that everybody wants to see. It's a fight that's been talked about for quite some time. It's the idea of featherweight champion Conor McGregor stepping up to 155 pounds to attempt to become the very first UFC champion that holds belts in 2 different weight classes at the same time. Conor McGregor, Eddie Alvarez. There's rumors that we're literally hours, if not days away from the fight being announced to headline the New York card. And in my opinion, if that isn't the fight that headlines the Madison Square Garden card for the UFC, then it's just not good enough for Madison Square Garden. I'm sorry. I mean, if you're going to go to MSG with a debut card, you've got to put on the absolute best fight you can put on, with all the weight classes available to you and all the entire roster. The fight that's got the most fan demand and the one that the entire community wants to see right now. They just want to see it for a few different reasons. Number one, they want to see if McGregor can actually do it. Number two, they want to see how Eddie Alvarez can, handle himself in the most highest pressure of scenarios. And we've seen in the past Aldo couldn't handle the pressure when it comes to a McGregor fight. But more than anything, I think we all just want to put this to bed. I think because McGregor's been chasing this idea of becoming a 2-weight champion for so long, to the detriment of the featherweight division, where the UFC had to create an interim championship while McGregor went away and obviously tried to get that championship off Rafael dos Anjos, which in then turn created this bizarre rivalry of 2016 against Nate Diaz. I think everybody is, wants to see this attempt out of the way. If he wins, great, then we can see what he wants to do next. But if he loses, fine. At least we can then put the attention and the focus back on the featherweight division. But yeah, it's got to be Eddie Alvarez, Conor McGregor, Simon. Is there anyone else, really, that's an option?
No. When it comes to the lightweight world title, it has to be Conor McGregor. Get the fight done, as you say, and then, everything can return to normality after that. The featherweight division can hopefully go back to having a proper undisputed champion with a belt that he's going to defend. And it'd be interesting to see what would happen if Conor McGregor lost against Eddie Alvarez. That would be very interesting, because I don't think he's got any real intention of going back to 145. But if he loses the lightweight title fight, then he really does find himself in a bit of a spot, and he'll then have to make a serious decision about his career. So, really looking forward to it. I think, all common sense suggests that is going to be the main event at Madison Square Garden. And as you say, they want Conor on that Madison Square Garden card. He is the biggest name in the sport right now, and they want to pack Madison Square Garden and put on a real super fight. And what better than a fight where someone can go for UFC history and become the first guy to hold 2 belts simultaneously in the UFC. Of course, that's betting without Eddie Alvarez, of course, who did an incredible job to take apart Rafael dos Anjos in Las Vegas earlier this year. Amazing performance from him. So is he, can he repeat the trick and do the same thing to Conor McGregor, or will McGregor go on and become the first ever 2-weight champion simultaneously in the UFC? But that's the fight that needs to be made for sure. Middleweight division, because we're jumping the welterweight division because we already know what's happening at welterweight. Tyron Woodley is taking on Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. We also know what's going to happen in the middleweight division. Michael Bisping is going to fight Dan Henderson. So my question is, who fights, if we assume that whoever wins this fight hangs around to defend their title, if Henderson wins, we understand he's retired. If Bisping wins, he isn't going to retire. So if Bisping wins this fight, who should he fight next, Sandhu?
That's a good question. I think it's got to be the winner of Rockhold and Jacare. I think prior to this scenario of Bisping coming on a 2 weeks notice and beating Rockhold for the title, I think Jacare was widely considered to be the true number one contender anyway. But now that he's matched up with Rockhold, who has beaten him before in Strikeforce, it does put an interesting spin on things, because if Rockhold wins, brilliant. You got the rematch with Bisping, you got the rivalry, or actually now you got the trilogy fight with Bisping, not the rematch, the trilogy fight, and that's got a nice storyline to it. And if Jacare wins, then yeah, great. Again, we're talking about merit. This is actually a great example of the money fight versus meritocracy, because I think Jacare is widely considered to be the guy in the middleweight division that deserves a shot that hasn't already fought for the title before. And then in Rockhold, you've got someone that's very marketable, got the rivalry with Bisping, a former champion, has headline and main evented UFC events before, and I would consider him to be the larger draw between him and Jacare. But if you're going to put a gun to my head, I think the Rockhold trilogy would make more sense than the Jacare fight, if Rockhold does beat Jacare. That's my humble opinion. What do you think, Si?
I totally agree with you. I've got written down here the winner of Rockhold versus Jacare. I think, as you say, Jacare is probably the most deserving guy in a middleweight division who hasn't fought for the belt yet. Rockhold is the most intriguing next opponent for Michael Bisping. If Michael Bisping can get past Dan Henderson, which is no formality, just ask some of Henderson's past opponents. It's unbelievable how that guy is still going and still knocking people out at his age, but he's still incredibly dangerous. Bisping himself knows that he has to be wary against Dan Henderson. The fight that will hold the most fan interest will undoubtedly be the Rockhold fight, and if Rockhold gets past Jacare, it's a no-brainer. You have to throw Chris Weidman into the mix as well. It looks like he's going to fight Yoel Romero in New York, and the winner of that fight will obviously be banging a drum for a title shot as well. And if the winner of that fight it turns out to be Yoel Romero, then that might have a little bit of credence, because we've seen Weidman fight for the title before. We haven't seen Romero fight for the title before, so it really depends. It depends on how the UFC want to do this. I mean, for me, Rockhold Jacare is a higher grade fight than Weidman versus Romero. They're both ridiculously high level matchups, but I think Rockhold Jacare is just that little bit higher, and I think the winner of that will be the worthy number one contender for whoever wins that main event at UFC 204. That was middleweight. We now look at the light heavyweight division. If there's a weight division in the UFC, Sandhu, where we need an injection of new blood, then maybe it's the light heavyweight division. I mean, the heavyweight division as well, potentially, but we've got one or two names working their way up. But at light heavyweight, it seems like we've got established people at the top of the division, and then a little bit of a gap between them and the rest. So I'm not expecting there to be a huge deviation in what we suggest here. But Daniel Cormier has got the 205 title right now. Who does he defend against next? Does he hold on and fight John Jones next? Does he fight Anthony Rumble Johnson next? I don't really think there's anybody else in the picture. I would definitely put him in with Rumble Johnson. I'd put him in there as soon as possible. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think at this stage with John Jones, he's just he's had too many chances, and he just keeps letting himself down, letting the fans down, letting the UFC down, letting the sport down. And I think here's what I do, right? Now, it looks as though Alexander Gustafsson is going to be fighting Little Nogueira in Sao Paulo in Brazil this November. Now say Gustafsson comes through that fight with flying colours, gets another win under his belt. That would be 2 back-to-back wins. He's got his mojo back. Here's what I'd do. I agree with you, Simon. I'd do DC versus Anthony Johnson for the belt. I'd just scrap the whole idea and concept of an interim championship. I don't even know why they've created that for John Jones, but at this stage, if the guy can't hold on to his UFC championship because he's getting in trouble, let alone an interim championship, what I'd do is I'd have DC and Anthony Johnson in the main event, and in the co-main event, again, if Gustafsson comes through with flying colours against the Nogueira, I'd put Gustafsson and Jones in the co-main event, because then what you've got your main event, and if something should happen to Anthony Johnson, or if something should happen to DC, then you can just bump up John Jones into that main event slot, because the AJ fight is one that's a fresh matchup and everybody's been wanting to see. And if you're going to, keep that interim championship around the waist of John Jones anyway, then why not let Anthony Johnson fight him while DC is injured? But if Anthony Johnson's the one that's injured, you've got the rematch ready made. They're already in camp. They're all prepared to fight on the same date. But if all of them stay healthy, then you've got DC and you've got Anthony Johnson fighting out for the belt, and then you've got a number one contenders fight between John Jones and Gustafsson, which in itself is one of the, if not the greatest light heavyweight match of all time, and it is a rematch that everyone's been clamoring to see for since they first fought 3 years ago. So DC, AJ, and Gustafsson, John Jones co-main event. That's my kind of ultimate matchmaking dream scenario.
Yeah, that would be perfect, wouldn't it? I think the timelines might possibly prevent that from happening, just because Gustafsson would probably need to do like a 30-day turnaround in order to make that fight, even if they did it on like December the 30th.
Well, I saw Anthony Johnson try and tempt DC for the New York card, and DC tweeted him back saying he wouldn't be ready for New York because he's injured. So and that would be a November card. I guess it would come down to how Gustafsson comes through the Nogueira fight in November. But I don't know. Say it was a first round finish and he's unscathed, and they're looking for the DC fight maybe in January, February. Then he's got some time. But yeah, you're right. The timelines could skew that a little bit.
That would be the ideal scenario, though. I mean, it always is. It always is when you've got the sort of number 1 v number 2, having number 3 v number 4 on the same fight card just makes total sense. It just doesn't always work out sort of logistically, but that would definitely be perfect. And for my money right now, Rumble Johnson is the number 1 scariest guy in the UFC. And if he was fighting Daniel Cormier tomorrow, I think I'd be backing Rumble Johnson to get the job done this time round. I think we're going to see a different Anthony Rumble Johnson when he gets in there with Cormier second time round. Can't wait to see that fight whenever they make it. The smart money suggests it may well be UFC 207. Could potentially be the Toronto card on December the 10th, 206. But that might be a little bit early. But yeah, quite possibly Vegas. But we'll have to wait and see. And that takes us to the final weight class, the big boys, the heavyweights. Stipe Miocic has only just defended his title, knocked out Alistair Overeem on home soil in Cleveland. The place went nuts. And now the question turns to who should he face next. Now, we've got a little bit of breathing room with this because Stipe has said he wants to take a little bit of time away. I think he wants to go on a honeymoon. He recently got married. He hasn't had a chance to go on honeymoon. So he's going to go off on honeymoon. He's going to chill out for a bit and come back fresh and raring to go in 2017. So if we assume all things are possible in that UFC heavyweight division, and obviously other fights will take place before then, who would be your pick to jump in there with Stipe for his next championship defence, Sandhu?
Well, we've got the possibility of a Doom fighting Velasquez, right? So theoretically, again, looking at meritocracy, you got 2 former champions battling it out while Stipe takes a bit of a rest. So the winner of that would obviously get a title shot next. The thing with Cain Velasquez is, and Cain Velasquez is my pick here, the only problem I've had with him in the past is consistency, his ability to fight regularly. He's very injury prone. He's the sick note of the UFC heavyweight division. And he has said recently that he's changed a lot in his camp. He's sparring a lot less. He's getting regular massages, and he's just doing things to look after his body a lot more. And as he gets that little bit older, I mean, if he can prove to compete against Verdum before the end of this year, that'll be 2 fights this year. And mate, if he can perform against Verdum like he did against Travis Brown at UFC 200, if he can then also enact revenge on Verdum in that type of fashion, there's just no question that Velasquez would be the right choice for the fight. In terms of, it's very interesting, this one, because in terms of markets, of course, you've got Velasquez with that, that Mexican background, and Mexico's obviously a really important market for the UFC. But Verdum is a big star and a big draw in Brazil too. So if Verdum got that chance, and he was able to get revenge on Stipe Miocic and get his belt back, then again you've got somebody you can bring back to the Brazilian market. So it's a bit of a tough one. But if I'm going to again put my gun to my head and I had to pick between the two, I'd pick Velasquez.
Yeah, I think if Kane can get past Fabricio second time around, then I think there's little argument. If Fabricio beats Kane and looks no better than he did against Travis Brown, I'd probably look elsewhere. And sort of the X factor, my sort of super sub coming off the bench, would be Junior Dos Santos. I think stylistically, JDS versus Stipe, it's a fight that I'd love to see. I'd love to see again. It's a fantastic matchup, and I think stylistically, I think it would make for a brilliant title fight. And Stipe has shown himself to be a little bit susceptible against strikers in the past. That's where he's had the most trouble. Stipe obviously lost to Junior Dos Santos by unanimous decision back in 2014. I actually thought Miocic won that fight. If I remember rightly, I think I had Miocic winning that fight. But it was a close fight, even though it was scored as a unanimous decision. But I think stylistically, I think that would be a great fight. You don't see too many heavyweight fights going 5 rounds and being brilliant, but that was definitely one of them. And that's a fight I would love to see again. If Cain Velasquez gets the job done against Fabricio, I think he's the natural next guy. But maybe the next guy after that would be JDS. Because I'd like to see him right back up there again, fighting for championship gold once more. Because I still think he's one of the very best heavyweights in the world. But I think in terms of pure quality, Stipe versus Cain is the one to make. That's our list. If anyone has got any wildly differing picks for any of those, are there any real sort of left field out there suggestions for title fights that maybe not straight away, but fights that you'd certainly love to see maybe further down the line in 2017? Chuck us a tweet and let us know. Let us know what title fights you'd like to see in 2017. We're on Twitter at the Brit Pack MMA. Send us a tweet. Let us know what you think of our picks, and let us know what you would do with some of these UFC world champions. That moves us on, Sandhu, to our Q&A. We're just talking about Twitter. People have been sending us questions again this week.
Absolutely, and once again, thank you to everyone that jumps on the Twitter machine and hits up myself, Simon, and the official Brit Pack handle, which is the Brit Pack MMA, with your questions. Again, feel free to hit us up throughout the week. Myself and Simon usually send out a reminder the morning of the day we're going to record the podcast. But yeah, really do appreciate everyone reaching out. It helps us create an entire segment for the show, so it's much appreciated. So the first question comes in from RG, Simon, and RG says, what do you make of Cyborg at 140 pounds? Does it foreshadow a 145 pound women's division? Catch weight with Ronda Rousey? What do you think? Now, Chris Cyborg is fighting Lina Landsberg this upcoming weekend in Brasilia, Brazil. That's the headline for the Fight Night card there in Brazil. I think Simon, you and me have spoken about this a few episodes ago. We both don't like the idea of Cyborg having to cut down to 140 pounds, especially in the current climate of weight cutting being so kind of detrimental to a fighter's health. And there was definitely, some squeamish and hard to watch scenes in the trailer for an upcoming, I think it's a documentary on Cyborg, where it kind of essentially shows her cutting weight prior to her UFC 198 fight. So in regards to it foreshadowing a 145-pound division, I really hope so, and we've spoken about this as well, Simon. I think you and me both in agreement. We would love to see it, but time and time and again, I keep seeing quotes from UFC President Dana White, essentially nixing it, saying it will be a good few years before we see that happen. My mind boggles. I'm just like, well, look, if you're going to use her, why make her cut to 140? Why not just let her fight at 145 pounds, which is her, healthiest weight class? Maybe she can fight for Invicta once, twice a year and defend the championship on Fight Pass, and then you can bring her up in a pay-per-view slot or a fight night card in Brazil, and maybe fight one of the UFC's bantamweight fighters that are happy to jump up to 145 pounds. What do you think, Si?
Yeah, it kind of annoys me because we're dealing with people's health, and which sounds kind of weird. This is a combat sport where people go in there and beat seven shades out of each other, but obviously we want it to be done under the most the safest conditions possible, and Cyborg cutting to 140 pounds is just it's just cruel. It shouldn't. She shouldn't be doing it. I mean, obviously, she's complicit in this. She's signing the contract and is agreeing to do it. But I think she needs people around her who are prepared to tell her, no, you're not doing this. You shouldn't do this. Because I mean, just before we went on air, Cyborg was on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani, and she said that as she was talking to him, she would weigh 165 pounds 4 days out from the weigh-in, and that she was told to start taking birth control pills by George Lockhart in order to help her drop weight, and she was she's 165 pounds. She's got to lose 24 pounds in 4 days. And we've already seen how hard the weight cut is for her, and it sounds as if this one's going to be even worse. So, and I tweeted earlier saying that it worries me a lot and all the rest of it. And there have been instances of UFC fighters who've gone in at short notice and cut ridiculous amounts of weight. Paul Redman, for his UFC debut, Redza, he actually tweeted me and said he cut 33 pounds in 12 days for a division he'd never fought in before. And it would have been 36 if he'd have actually made weight, because he didn't make weight. So, and that was nuts. And I tweeted him back and told him he was a crazy man. And 33 pounds in 12 days is ridiculous. Cyborg's having to lose 24 pounds in 4 days. Which is just unbelievable, and we already know that she's tight at the weight, ridiculously tight at 140 pounds. Lena Landsberg is a 45er. Why couldn't they have made this fight at 45? That's what I don't understand, and it really is. It's like they're trying to force Cyborg into some sort of position whereby they can make these money fights with the likes of Holly Holm or maybe even Ronda Rousey or someone like this. But yeah, it's, the inescapable truth, Sandhu, is she's too big. She's just too, she isn't a 135 pound athlete. Never will be. And really, she shouldn't be a 140 pound athlete. If we saw fighters completely ruining themselves in the way that we saw Cyborg ruining herself to reach 140, we'd be screaming at them to move up in weight. The problem Cyborg has is she doesn't have a home when it comes to weight classes in the UFC. And while the UFC has said there's no plans to add any new weight divisions right now, there's been talk of 145, there's been talk of 125. That doesn't mean that they can't put fights on at her natural weight class. Lena Landsberg can fight and does fight at 145 pounds. Cyborg fights at 145 pounds. To not have the fight at 145 pounds is just beyond my comprehension. I don't get it, especially when we know the weight cutting issues that she's had in the past. It's dangerous. That is the long and short of it. This isn't someone who isn't prepared to lose the weight. This is someone who is physically giving themselves an awful lot of trauma to even get close to losing that much weight. I just don't know what to say. I honestly don't know what to say. She shouldn't fight below 145 pounds. and she needs a manager. She needs a boyfriend or fiance. I think she's got a boyfriend who I believe is actually a fighter. I think it's Rael, but I think or at least was her boyfriend. So he knows all about cutting weight for fights. So it needs someone to basically say, this is not good for you. This is not good for you. And that's what needs to happen. You know, it's so difficult, and you know, I just hope that nothing bad happens, because you know we don't want to see that in our sport. You know, and we don't want that to happen to anybody.
No, you're absolutely right, Simon. And I suppose the only kind of like, I suppose, saving grace maybe on this occasion is, compared to her last fight, which was at 140 pounds at UFC 198, the early weigh-ins weren't in effect then. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Simon, you can correct me if I'm wrong, UFC 199 was the first event that came into effect, because it was held in California. That's kind of been leading the early weigh-ins anyway. And essentially after that, it's become the norm. So I suppose this week, obviously, you know, I guess we're all going to be paying very close attention to what she looks like at the actual weigh-ins on Friday morning. But at least it'll give her an extra, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 12 hours to hydrate. So she gets a full day and a half, as opposed to just 24 hours in the previous setup. But it's kind of weird. I mean, I just feel like maybe the UFC are doing this so that somewhere down the road they can say, oh, well, we've got the Invicta 145 champion, and we've got the Misha Tates of the world, or the Ronda Rousey, or the Holly Holm, or who are former or our current UFC 135-pound champion. Here, we're going to meet in the middle. It's a super fight, and we're going to do it at 140, you know? And it might be easier for the woman coming up in weight, like your Ronda Rouseys and your Misha Tates or your Holly Holm, but it's just putting so much stress on Cyborg's body just to drop the extra 5 pounds or the extra 4 pounds. I guess she'll probably weigh in at 141, which will make it legal and official. But hearing stuff like taking, you know, birth control pills and just putting, you know, stuff like that in your body to try and make the weight, it's heartbreaking to hear that this has been put on her, and the fact that she's maybe forced into a position where she just has to accept the situation because this is the way she makes her living, Simon. And if this is the best way for her to make the most money possible in the short window of being a fighter, it's sad, but you know, it is what it is, and it's just unfortunate, really unfortunate. But I guess it takes members of the media like us, it'll take fans and hopefully fellow fighters to speak about it as often and consistently as possible, so that perhaps it becomes a big enough issue where perhaps the UFC rethink things moving forward when it comes to Cyborg's fights. Yeah.
It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one, and the most important thing is that when she competes healthy, and you know, irrespective of the you know, whatever the scales weigh on weigh-in day, that's the number one important thing. And if the UFC want to get the best out of her as well, it's in their best interest as well. So that's what I would do. I would just let her fight at her proper weight class and find appropriately sized opponents to fight against. That's what I would do anyway.
Absolutely. Right, so moving on, Stuart Tuckwell tweets in and says, what fighters or fights would you like to see on the Belfast card? So that's a good question. Thanks, Stuart. I'll tell you what, Simon, the one fighter that comes to mind straight away when I heard about the Belfast card isn't actually a fighter on the current UFC roster. It's a guy that got cut earlier this year, and his name's Norman Park. The lad is from Northern Ireland. I'm sure he's just kicking himself that he's not currently in the UFC when he heard that they're going to Belfast. Now, he is fighting on the ACB card up at the SSE Hydro in Glasgow, which you're going to be in attendance for, Simon, in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah.
Do you think it's outside the realm of possibility that if Norman Park can get a good win, get back in the win column, with a Belfast card around the corner, perhaps can get some line of communication going with the UFC to get back on that card? Do you think that's feasible?
I think timelines will be the biggest barrier to that happening. I think it would be a crying shame if he wasn't on the card, just because he's been such an ambassador for Northern Irish mixed martial arts, and has been really the ploughing a lone furrow really when it comes to fighting at the very, very highest level. And now they've got this big show coming. It would seem like the obvious opportunity to give him a good high profile fight, but it's just such a shame that they cut him a matter of weeks before they announced the event. So it's unfortunate for Norman, and I know he's going to be fighting at ACB, and I'm sure they'll look after him at ACB, but you can't help but think he'd love to be fighting over there in Belfast in November. But I have a feeling that just timelines, and I don't necessarily think he's going to go in there and claim a quick fire first round win. Norman tends to get involved in 3-round wars with people, so unless he can go in there and do something we haven't seen from him in a while, and that's polish someone off in super quick time, you would assume that he's going to have a fair few lumps and bumps after that fight in Glasgow. So I think that, as much as anything, will be a barrier to him competing in Northern Ireland, which would be a big shame. But I have a feeling that just the logistics of it may just won't work out in his favour, which would be a shame.
Lewis tweets in and says, "Is Mickey Gall actually capable of beating Super Sage, or is it wishful thinking as we want to see a great fight?" So for those of you that perhaps haven't been keeping up with the news as of late, following his win against CM Punk at UFC 203, Mickey Gall called out Super Sage Northcutt. It was the right move to make. It was a brilliant and post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. We've got two guys here who essentially have used the new kind of online digital web series called Looking for a Fight by the UFC as a platform, as a launch pad for their careers. And it's a fight that I hope gets made. Is Mickey Gall capable of beating Super Sage? I think he is, especially if the fight takes place at Mickey Gall's weight class, which is 170 pounds. Now, Sage Northcutt typically fights at 155, but has fought at welterweight in the past. If they make this fight at welterweight, I think given what we've seen, although it being quite limited of Mickey Gall, I think the fact that he's got an excellent ground game, I think that's where Sage Northcutt, we've seen him get into trouble in the past. And I can see this fight being very competitive, and I can see Mickey Gall giving him a lot of trouble on the ground. And is he capable of beating him, which is what the question asks? I think he is capable of beating him. Simon, what do you think?
I think he's capable of beating him. I think we said it on last week's show. I think it is the perfect matchup, probably for both guys. To be honest with you, I think Sage was sort of thrown into the deep end very quickly and found himself up against a bigger, stronger, more experienced guy in Brian Barberena and lost. He needed to be sort of brought back down a little bit and fight someone with maybe a little bit less experience. And I do think Sage will probably be more comfortable fighting at 170 anyway. So I don't think the fact that it's at 170 would be a major detriment to him. I think he'd probably prefer that. But I think, could Mickey Gall beat him? Yeah, and I'll tell you why Mickey Gall could beat him, because Mickey Gall, I think, has got a much, much better grappling game than Sage has got. I think Sage's skill set lies in striking. He's got very good sort of karate-based striking. That's where he has probably the best chance of success. Mickey's got a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt. And I think if he gets Sage to the mat, and we've seen Sage when he's back on the canvas in the past, he hasn't looked too clever. And I think Mickey Gall could have some joy down there. I think if he can get Sage to the mat and get to work, I think he could submit him. But we know Sage is quite a dangerous striker. So it's going to be all. I think the key will be in the transition. I think whoever can dictate where the fight takes place will be the person who eventually wins the fight. But I think it's a competitive fight. I think it's an exciting fight, and I'm looking forward to it. Surely they have to make it. It's a fight that's crying out to be made. It makes all the sense in the world. And whether they do it in New York, whether they do it at in Las Vegas in December, I think it needs to be made. And a better fight pass featured prelim you couldn't wish to make. So I think that's absolute no-brainer. Make the fight, and I think it's if I was betting on the fight, I'd probably lean towards Mickey Gall. I've got to be honest with you. I think he just has a few more ways to win the fight than Sage does.
Vinny Massaro tweets in and says, "Greatest American fighter, Hendo or Couture?" Now, he's given us a specific option there, Simon. Obviously, if you wanted to throw other American fighters into the mix, the obvious one that comes to mind is John Jones. But if you're going to pick between Dan Henderson and Randy Couture, who are you picking there, Simon?
Dan Henderson. I'm picking Dan Henderson. He's done it in multiple weight classes, as has Randy Couture. But the difference between Randy Couture and Dan Henderson is that Henderson has excelled on both sides of the MMA divide, if you like. He was over there in Japan and won 2 world championships in Pride, and to be able to do that against some of those guys over there is ridiculous. And that was when Pride was probably the gold standard of the sport back then. He came over to the UFC. I know he's never won UFC Championship gold, but he's been up there and he's been campaigning for a ridiculously long amount of time. He's still a ranked contender in the middleweight division, and he's obviously going to fight for the world title in Manchester at 204. But I think his body of work stands up against Randy Couture's. I think Randy was a little bit more sporadic in terms of when he fought and where he fought, whereas I think Hendo's been a lot more consistent. And I would say that his CV sits a little bit higher than Randy's in the overall list, I would say.
I completely agree with everything you say, Simon, but I have to go with Couture here because I think winning UFC championship belts just mean that little bit more when it comes to, accolades. And when you're looking at, obviously, Henderson, 100%. He did it in Strikeforce. He did it in Pride. He beat Fedor. He's done it all. And you know what? Who knows? Maybe in a few weeks' time, Simon, if he beats Michael Bisping for the championship belt, then the conversation completely changed. Then without a shadow of a doubt, if you're going to pick between the two in terms of the greatest American MMA fighter of all time, then 100%, I'd say Dan Henderson without even thinking about it twice. But for me personally, given the time that he fought in, the different weight classes, the age he fought at, I know that it wasn't too long ago, but I think even just in 2016, there's so much more available to fighters to look after themselves and recuperate, and maybe you can get some more miles out of the engine than you could have perhaps maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So I'm going to lean the other way a little bit. I'm going to go for Couture on that one.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, the final question comes in from George, who says, "Do you think Bisping will train his usual way or try to reproduce his camp before Rockhold, and does it matter?" So just to kind of paint the picture here a little bit, obviously the Rockhold fight at UFC 199, it came on, I think it was about 3 weeks' notice. And at the time, Michael Bisping was up in Toronto, I believe, shooting a movie, the Triple X movie. Is it a sequel? Is it a relaunch of the franchise? I'm not too sure. But anyway, that's beside the point. He was up in Toronto, got the call, and literally had to put together a short 2.5 week camp before the fight. And given that, he actually said in his pre-fight and post-fight interviews that he felt a lot better. His body hadn't been through the wear and tear of a 8, 10, 12-week camp. And he said that he basically felt a lot fresher in the fight, and he felt as though everything was just firing on all cylinders, and he was at his absolute maximum potential capacity in terms of physical peakness because of how fresh he felt. Whereas in the past, he said that he'd usually go into fights or get into fight week, maybe at 70 or 80% because he'd already been through, a war of a camp and had a few knocks and a few niggly injuries that he'd been carrying with him. So it's interesting to see what he does this time. I mean, he's been doing a few media tours. He has been, filming some more movies and other bits and pieces during what would normally be considered a standard camp. But I do remember him saying after the Rockhold win, when he won the championship, that he was going to change things around. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, looking at a social media feed, I think he may have just started camp maybe a few weeks ago. I know he was in the UK a few weeks ago, and he just got back to LA or the California area in the last 4 or 5 days. So I think the shorter camp might be the way forward for Bisping. Does it matter? Well, I think clearly it would matter if Bisping won a championship off the back of a 3-week camp, and he said that was the key to victory for him in terms of how his body felt. Then absolutely, maybe that's the best thing for a guy in his late 30s to be doing, is having shorter camps, put less stress on the body, just to make sure that when it comes to the night of the fight, he's able to fire on all cylinders. What do you think, Si?
I think there's a balance to be struck. I think obviously the way he came in for that Rockhold fight was a bit of a one-off situation, a bit of an anomaly, and I think probably doing that again as the champion would be a little bit silly. But having said that, what he has learned from that experience, and I've spoken to him about it, is he does overtrain. He does overtrain, and he completely admits that. So he may well have a slightly shorter training camp than usual. Rather than 12 weeks, he might knock it down to 8 weeks or 6 weeks. But he's still going to give it a solid training camp. He's not just going to come in with like a week and a half, 2 weeks, like he did for that Luke Rockhold fight. So I think there's a balance to be struck there, and it's all about, because you want to be at your best. It's all about peaking. And if you look at British sport, and you look at the British Olympic cycling team, they're a great example of peaking. Some of those guys didn't win the World Championships. And they were going into the Olympic Games, and the Americans had won the world title in one event, or the Australians or the New Zealanders had won the world title in one event. But when it mattered, the Olympic Games, Team GB turned up and absolutely swept the board in the velodrome, and that was because they tapered their training to a point. They'd got it to such a high standard that they knew that they would be at their optimum on the time of the Olympic cycling events, and that's what it's all about. The Holy Grail is finding that sweet spot, and Michael Bisping went in there, and I think he won that fight performing on adrenaline as much as anything else. But this time, obviously, he's got to be a little bit more calculated. But yeah, going in there at 100%, not beaten up and knackered from overtraining, but just being sharp enough, fit enough, and fresh. That's what you need to be when you get in the octagon, because if these fights start to string out, you'll get found out really quick. Bisping's cardio has always been on point, and we haven't seen him fade too often in fights, even though he says he overtrains. So maybe if he just knocks a week or 3 off his training camp, we might see an even fresher, even faster, even more explosive Michael Bisping at UFC 204. But I wouldn't expect him to come in at anything less than 100%, because he always does.
Absolutely, and that wraps it up for us this week, Si, in the Q&A segment. So once again, thank you to everyone for tweeting in. Do appreciate it. Like I said before, it actually helps me and Simon create another segment for the show, so much appreciated. And by all means, do tweet us throughout the week. If anything pops up in your mind, it's something that you want me and Simon to discuss, whether it's UFC, Bellator, local MMA here in the UK, get us on Twitter, let us know what it is that you want us to talk about or ask us, and we'll make sure that we address it on next week's show.
Great stuff. You can listen to us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Acast, and on SoundCloud. The SoundCloud address is soundcloud.com/The Brit Pack. It's acast.com/The Brit Pack. And obviously search for us on iTunes and Stitcher. We are The Brit Pack. So nice and easy. Give us a search. If you're on iTunes, please do give us a rating, give us a review if you're enjoying what you're listening to. And as Sandhu says, any suggestions for the show, please do ping us a tweet during the week and let us know. If we didn't get to ask your questions out this week, we apologise. We will do our best to get as many as we can in each week. And I think the question section is fast becoming the most popular section of the show. So get your questions in nice and early next week, and Sandhu will compile a master list. And no doubt we'll be back again next Monday to answer your questions and talk about the aftermath of UFC Fight Night in Brasilia, and we start the build-up towards UFC 204 as the excitement starts to build ahead of Michael Bisping's homecoming with the UFC middleweight title as he looks to take on Dan Henderson. That's all we've got for you this week on episode 9 of the Brit Pack. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the fights next weekend, and we'll speak to you next week.